became aware of was her tongue. It felt alien and dry, too big for her mouth. She sucked on it noisily and pried her eyes open, squinting into the dark to try and figure out where she was. "Lights on," she croaked, somewhat relieved when her timid eyes were assaulted by violent fluorescence. At least she'd made it somewhere that recognised her voice last night before collapsing. "Lights 50%, she groaned, and the room dimmed to a less challenging ambience. She raised herself gingerly to a seated position and went back to prying her eyes open. Her subsidised pilot's lodgings were compact and functional, for which she felt extremely grateful as she swung her feet over the side of the narrow gel bunk and popped the lid off of a coal box with an outstretched toe. She reached down, wincing as her forehead throbbed, then pulled out a pouch of water and twisted off the cap. Drinking deeply, her tongue tingled as her brain continued to thump behind her eyebrows. She sank back down onto the narrow bunk, moaning. She tried to piece together the details of last night. She'd gone to her parents' quarters. She remembered getting there and helping herself to a large drink as Andrew, the compartment boy, went to fetch her mother. Nothing after that. She scanned the room with hopeful eyes in case she'd managed to rescue her cloth. All she saw were the sparse essentials and stacked lockers typical of subsidised living. Most pilots were away so much they didn't need extravagant quarters and were used to living in cramped conditions on their vessels anyway. She stretched back over her head and felt for the ID panel, planting her palm across it. The computer beeped. "You have 4 messages." Play messages. The first was from the Slough Observer's Wellbeing Centre, welcoming her back and offering a discounted rate on their range of anti-atrophy spa packages. The next was from her mother, presumably not long after she'd landed, as her voice was bright and breezy, inviting Angel over for supper and reminding her about the reception the following evening. Angel winced. An imperial delegation was visiting the space station, and she was expected to roll out and play the dutiful daughter, to be sneered at by puffed-up politicians and pompous plutocrats. Then there was Captain Riley, who would be doing more leering than sneering. The thought made her skin curl up at the edges. The third message was from Roland. Apparently she'd made it back to the Zen garden last night and owed him 20 credits for a shelf full of glasses smashed during an animated game of Flat Rabbit. And finally there was another message from her mother. Earlier this morning, this one brief and humourless. "I hope you'll be enjoying your hangover and that you will leave it in the waste pipes with your stinking attitude for tonight's reception. Andrew is bringing over a dress for you this afternoon. You'd better be wearing it. Don't be late." There was a meaningful pause. "Or drunk." Angel slipped onto the huge observation deck and skirted the edge of the growing throng. Wealthy patrons, feds and investors, all dressed up in their finest and positively glowing to be seen at such an exclusive affair in one of the system's most decadent venues. She'd taken a shuttle pod over from the space station a couple of hours earlier rather than get caught up in the gravy train of executive shuttles organised for the guests. It had given her the chance to have a swim in one of the spas to wash off the dust and grime from the space station before stiffening her resolve with a hull stripper or 3 in the spinner's arms. Even though such an ostentatious display of wealth went against Angel's principles, she had to admit, the view from the overlook was kind of spectacular. The clear vision panels in the outer hull were huge, at least 200 metres across and running the entire circumference of the vast ringed chamber so that the planet could be seen through a complete rotation of the Coriolis. It coasted gracefully around and around, along with everything else in space, giving the impression that this vast luxury hangar was at the very centre of the universe. The overlook occupied the upper ring of the Observer One's main hub. the most exclusive of the 3 renovated generation ships that had brought their ancestors all the way from Earth over 1,000 years ago. The ships were beyond vast. You could fit a Federation battlecruiser into the central ecodome and still have room to maneuver it above the vegetation that made up the living, biological heart of these deep space civilization boats. The dome spun with centripetal force to create the illusion of gravity that the plants needed to flourish, but fully adjustable depending on requirements. For 2 nights, exclusive event, the gravity was set at a refreshing 0.8 G, which caused sagging jowls to lift flatteringly and made dancing in heels a lot more comfortable. A huge Imperial cruiser coasted across Angel's View, trailing a swarm of angry-looking vipers as passenger-class cruisers queued to drop off more guests for the party. A serve bot glided past, bearing a tray of glasses full of bubbly golden liquid that Angel took to be alcohol. She swiped 2, one for her and one for later, and then started scanning the room for friendlies. The guests were mostly orbitals, quite noisy ones too, and visitors, predominantly Imperials by the look of the gaudy attire, although she recognised a few muted Federal colours in there as well. There was a spattering of token spinners too, easily picked out by their short, stocky frames and broad shoulders and thick foreheads, evolved through several centuries of biological tailoring living down inside the planet. Far from being second-class citizens, spinners has always been revered and highly valued, so named because of the barbaric way that their ancestors had been trained to survive Slough's oppressive 1.5 G atmosphere. Today, they still held a lot of sway, both politically and in business, but you didn't often see them at posh orbital events like this, on account of their reaction to booze, which invariably made things messy quite quickly as their overachieving circulatory systems deployed the intoxication of alcohol with ruthless efficiency. It was one of the reasons that the clubs and bars on the less exclusive Observer 3 were so popular with stag parties from down in the Stokes. Angel spotted Stuart Forgey waving at her from over by the canapé belt. He was a press officer at Stoke Pogues Industries, a lean and nervous-looking man in his 40s with kind eyes and a slight stoop, and despite what you might expect from his professions, probably one of the more genuine people here tonight. Angel raised the hand of acknowledgement and started weaving her way towards him. Suddenly, her momentum was halted by an arm thrust out from the throng to bar her way. She stopped abruptly and felt hot breath on her cheek. "Well, hello, my angel." The words slithered up the back of her neck and around her throat, causing her breath to catch and her skin to try and crawl away from them. Captain Riley. She spun to face him as he captured her hips from behind, pressing through the crowd pelvis first in an effort to get closer to her. Good evening, Captain. Angel's face burned under his scrutiny as he pressed her body away from his, hands against the flat of his lapels of his naval uniform. She always felt like she'd forgotten to wear clothes when he looked at her. "Well, you're in a hurry. Stop and have a drink with me." He slid his hands from her hips and closed them about her wrists, squeezing a fraction too tight as she edged away from him towards the canapes. Oh, sorry, no can do," she said awkwardly, wishing she hadn't agreed to wear a dress as his eyes roamed down towards her cleavage. "Very important night, politically." "Well, you don't need me to tell you that. Of course, I have to catch up with PR." She nodded towards Stuart, who was making his way towards her with a look of concern etched onto his face. The Navy man glanced dubiously at the lanky spin doctor, narrowing his eyes with suspicious annoyance. But he loosened his grip anyway, and Angel slipped free. "Well, I will see you later then," he said, clicking his heels together and bowing formally as she was swallowed into the crowd.